They planned a beautiful memorial candles, flowers, heartfelt speeches. Everyone thought I was gone. But just as the room fell silent in mourning, I opened the church doors and walked in holding proof I had never died. If you've ever felt betrayed by your own family, if you've ever vanished from someone's life and no one cared to ask why, this story is for you. Because sometimes all it takes is showing up at the right moment, saying nothing, and letting the truth speak for itself. The kettle whistled, breaking the soft stillness of my apartment. I moved on autopilot, pouring boiling water through the coffee grounds, watching it bloom and swirl as steam fogged the window over the sink. Outside, Boston was still caught in that in-between season, spring in theory, but the wind still bit like January. This was my routine now. Wake up, brew coffee, fold silence into every corner of my day. I liked it this way. Quiet. Predictable. Anonymous. When life rips you out of the world you once knew, you learn to rebuild yourself in small, steady rituals. I reached for my mug, chipped but familiar, just as my phone buzzed. I didn't think much of it. Notifications were rare. The people who knew I was alive could be counted on one hand, and none of them messaged before noon. But when I picked up the phone and saw the name on the screen, my stomach flipped. Mrs. Langford. I hadn't heard that name in 3 years. She was our neighbor when I still lived in my parents' house. Sweet, nosy kind in that old-fashioned way, always pressing warm banana bread into my hands or waving from her porch. She used to call me Bright-Eyed Bella back when that name still felt like mine. Why would she be reaching out now? There was no message, no greeting. Just a single video file. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the play button. I didn't want to know what it said. Some old photo, a memory. A death I wasn't ready to open any door that led back to the life I'd buried. But curiosity is a persistent ghost. I tapped the screen. The video began with the slow, shaky zoom of an old iPhone camera capturing the inside of St. Andrew's Church, a place I hadn't stepped foot in since I was 16. The soft echo of an organ hummed in the background, solemn and low. The camera drifted toward the altar. And then I saw them. My parents. My mother, dressed in a black lace dress she'd once worn to a fundraiser, stood with a tissue pressed to her cheek. Her hair was curled into its usual tight perfection. My father stood beside her holding a folded piece of paper. He wore the navy suit he reserved for important clients. Behind them sat a closed casket. Next to it, propped up on an easel, a framed photograph of me. I blinked. Number. That couldn't be. My name was printed underneath in elegant white script. Isabella Marie West, 1991, 2020. I didn't hear the rest of the organ. I didn't register the way my mother's hand fluttered against her chest. All I heard was my father's voice as he began reading. She was always a complicated girl, he said, with a tone too smooth, too rehearsed, but we loved her deeply. We did everything we could. My hands went numb. I scrubbed backward. Rewatched. It didn't change. My funeral. They were holding my funeral. And I was very much alive. I watched it again. And again. Like if I replayed it enough times the truth would shift. But it didn't. Their faces stayed composed, their grief performed. My photo remained there, frozen in time, me at 28, smiling under the sun, wearing the same necklace I'd left behind the night they kicked me out. I sat down on the kitchen floor, coffee, forgotten phone balanced on my knees. Was this a dream? A delusion? I opened my banking app. Still active. I pulled out my ID. Still valid. I checked the lock on my front door as if I needed proof of existence. But they were mourning me, publicly, elegantly, completely. I rewatched the last 10 seconds of the video where the camera swung around to show the mourners in the pews. People I recognized, people I hadn't seen in years. My high school literature teacher. The neighbor who'd once babysat me. Even my best friend from college, Lucy, tears streaking her face, holding a single white rose. And not one of them had called. Not one had checked, not one had even tried. To them, I was gone. And they had moved on. A flicker of something sharp and unnameable ignited in my chest. Not sadness, not rage. A kind of grief that doesn't wail but freezes hollow and wide. I stood and walked to the bathroom. The mirror reflected a woman with dark circles under her eyes, hair messy, sweatshirt too big. I touched the glass, tracing the edge of my own jawline. "I'm still here," I whispered. But the silence didn't answer. I opened the cabinet. Inside, a dusty bottle of expired aspirin, half a tube of lip balm, and a travel toothbrush. I reached past them and pulled out a shoebox I hadn't touched in months. Inside were fragments of my old life documents, a photo of me with my dog Oliver, the envelope that held my birth certificate. I stared at it. What do you do when the world erases you while you're still breathing? You scream, you disappear, you fight. Or maybe you start by watching the funeral one more time just to remember who exactly buried you. And then you make a decision. Because if they went to such great lengths to kill me on paper, there had to be a reason. And I was about to find out what it was. The first thing I felt after watching the funeral was disbelief. The second was pain. But the third, what came later after the coffee turned cold and the apartment turned dark, was memory. Not just any memory, the memory. The one I'd packed away so tightly I'd convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was. And it started with a red ledger and a question I never saw coming. It was 3 years ago. I was working as the financial controller for our family's company West and Rose Interiors, a mid-sized design firm my grandfather built from the ground up. Numbers were always my language. I never wanted the spotlight like Fiona. I just wanted balance sheets that closed clean and a sense that I belonged. We were wrapping up quarter-end reconciliations when I noticed the discrepancy: $80, 231.42 missing from one of our operating accounts. I flagged it immediately. I double-checked. Triple-checked. I pulled receipts. Transaction logs. Cross-referenced every single line. It wasn't a mistake, it was theft. I told my father first. He looked at me like I'd told him his house was on fire. His jaw locked tight, but he said nothing. Just nodded once slowly and told me he'd look into it. The next day Fiona was in my office before I even got my coat off. "Why are you digging through things that aren't yours?" She snapped, eyes flashing with that sharp mix of panic and entitlement that only she could weaponize. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The logs spoke for themselves. Later that night, I confronted her in the kitchen. Our parents sat at the table, silent, tense. Fiona paced like a cornered animal. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. She looked at me, eyes cold, and said, "You always wanted to be the hero, didn't you? The good daughter. The smart one. Congratulations, Bella. Now you get to be the martyr too." I remember my mother's voice. Soft, measured, deadly. "Don't make this worse than it already is." I looked at her stunned. Me, I'm not the one who stole $80,000. She didn't blink. Better one daughter ruined than both. And my father, he didn't even look at me. He just stood and left the room. That was it. No questions, no defense. No attempt to understand, just silence. I left the next morning. I wasn't fired, I wasn't disowned, not officially. But I knew. The lock code on the front door was changed. My name was removed from the company payroll within a week. And within 2 the rumors began. She had problems. She was under stress. She took the money for personal reasons. People didn't ask questions, they just nodded. The prodigal daughter had finally cracked. I tried reaching out to friends, old colleagues, even extended family. At first they answered with awkward pauses and tight-lipped sympathy. Then came the missed calls, the unanswered texts, and finally, nothing. One by one the doors closed. I wasn't just fired, I was erased. And Fiona. She went on like nothing happened. Posted, filtered selfies. Got a promotion. Flew to Mexico. She told the world she was thriving. She even made a post with a quote that read, "Sometimes you have to let toxic people go even if they're family." And the comments poured in. "You're so brave. Cutting ties is hard but necessary. You deserve peace." They believed her. All of them. Because she was beautiful and charming and loud. And I was gone. I moved out of state then, out of the country. I changed my phone number, shut down my social media. Not out of shame but out of necessity. I needed the world to stop defining me by a lie I didn't create. But even thousands of miles away, the betrayal clung to me like smoke. There's a particular kind of grief that comes when the people who raised you choose to sacrifice you. It's not like a breakup or even death. It's being cut out of the story of your own life. As if your worth only extended as far as your silence. I tried to build something new. A life outside of the West name. I worked as a barista in a sleepy seaside town in Portugal. I learned to cook rice without burning it. I taught myself to sleep without checking my phone for missed calls, but it never left me. That night. That kitchen. The look in my mother's eyes when she said better one daughter ruined than both. She didn't flinch. And that was the moment I knew I had never really belonged to them. Not as I was, only as who they wanted me to be. Smart but not smarter than Fiona. Helpful but never in the spotlight. Quiet, agreeable, and visible when needed. When I stopped fitting that mold, they didn't correct me. They cut me out. And now, watching the funeral they staged for me, I realized something even more chilling. They hadn't just sacrificed me 3 years ago. They had been planning my disappearance. Erasing me from records. Social circles, family events. Whispers had been replacing my voice for years, and now with a eulogy and a framed photo they'd made it official. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was the dead sister. The one they buried so the other could bloom. I returned to the US in late October. The air smelled of old leaves and wood smoke. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, tighter, dimmer, like the past had shrunk while I'd been away. I told no one. Not that anyone would have listened. My apartment, a one-bedroom sublet in Cambridge, had yellowing wallpaper and floors that creaked like reluctant bones. I didn't mind, it was a roof. A temporary station while I figured out how to reclaim my life. Reclaim. That word sounded so full, so possible. But it was a lie. The unraveling began at the bank. I needed to reopen a checking account to begin rebuilding. I had my passport, my social security number, my birth certificate, even my tax ID. I waited in line like everyone else, clutching a folder filled with documents that should have proven my identity beyond question. The woman behind the glass smiled politely at first. Until she typed my name. "I'm sorry," she said, eyebrows furrowing. "There seems to be an issue." My stomach nodded. "What kind of issue?" She glanced down, then back up, her voice lowered. "Your file is marked deceased." The word hung in the air like gun smoke. "I'm sorry, what?" She leaned in, tapping at her keyboard. "You're flagged in our system. Date of death the 16th of July 2020. That's why the account won't activate." I laughed, because that's what you do when someone tells you you're dead while you're standing there very much breathing. "That's a mistake," I said. "Obviously. I'm here. She was already shaking her head. "I understand. But we can't proceed without clearing the status first. That's something you'll need to take up with the Social Security Administration." I walked out with the folder pressed tightly to my chest like it might shield me from erasure. The next stop was the DMV. I needed a new state ID. Something simple. Something real. They refused. "Your record has been flagged," the clerk said without meeting my eyes. "I'm standing right here," I replied. "Yes, but not in the system." I tried my old email next. I hadn't touched it in over a year, but I remembered the password. When I entered it, the screen blinked, then showed a message. "This account has been deactivated due to user decease. Please contact support." I sat there staring at the words. User decease. Like I was a file. A login. A forgotten memory. I dialed the helpline, clinging to some flicker of reason. But after verifying my name, the voice on the line gave me the same script. "Our system indicates that the account holder has passed away. We can't reopen it." My voice cracked. "I'm not dead." Silence. Then a robotic apology. "We're sorry for your loss." I hung up. I couldn't feel my hands. Later that evening, I stood in the middle of a CVS aisle under flickering fluorescent lights trying to buy toothpaste. The self-checkout froze when I inserted my card. An employee came over and asked me to confirm my identity. I told her my name, my address, showed her the state ID I still carried from before. She scanned it. "This was marked invalid," she said. I stared at her. "It's not expired, it's not recognized." "Recognized by who?" I whispered. Her mouth tightened. "By the system." That night I lay awake in my bed, eyes locked on the ceiling. My body was still, my breath steady. But something inside me had come unmoored. I began to wonder, if the world doesn't acknowledge your existence, do you really exist at all? In dreams, I walked into rooms where no one turned to look. I yelled, but the sound vanished in air. I waved frantically, reached out to touch people I once loved, and their faces remained blank. I became the ghost they'd created. I started having a recurring nightmare. In it, I was at a dinner table. My parents sat at either end. Fiona was next to my mother pouring wine. My chair was empty. They toasted, laughed. The seat meant for me stayed unoccupied. When I stood and screamed, the entire room blurred, like I wasn't part of the image anymore. Like I'd never been. The next morning, I took the subway downtown. Rush hour. People packed shoulder to shoulder. Phones glowing, coffee sloshing, conversations humming around me. I watched them. How they never looked at me. Not directly. Not once. I tried something strange. I stepped into someone's path just enough to force acknowledgement. The man barely paused. He muttered something under his breath and moved past me as if I were a gust of cold wind. I didn't feel real. Not in my body. Not in my name. Not in this world. That's when the tears came. Not loud, not sudden. Just slow, steady grief. I didn't cry because I was sad. I cried because I was invisible. I had crossed some invisible threshold. No longer living in the margins, now completely off the page. And it terrified me how easily the world moved on. There's a word for that, I think. When something ceases to be recognized. When your fingerprints vanish and no system reflects you back. Erasure. It's not loud. It's not violent. It's just absence. Quiet. Absolute. But I wasn't going to stay invisible. Because even if no one else saw me, I saw myself. And I was done letting their version of my death define the shape of my life. There's a silence that doesn't come from the world around you, but from somewhere deeper. Inside the bone. Underneath the skin. A silence that hums so loud it drowns out even your own breath. That was the silence I lived in for weeks. After the bank. After the DMV. After the 5th attempt to reactivate my email was met with a polite pre-programmed, "We regret the loss." Each rejection chipped away at my sense of self until I didn't know where Isabella West ended and the version they created, the one who died in a fictional car crash, began. I stopped going outside, stopped brushing my hair, stopped pretending I was okay. I existed between walls. Ate when I remembered. Drank from the faucet. My phone stayed on airplane mode. The city outside continued its rhythm, horns, sirens, laughter bleeding through window panes like another language I no longer spoke. One night I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out an old flash drive. I didn't even remember what was on it, only that I'd labeled it home. I plugged it into my laptop. The folder opened with a few photos and 2 short videos. The first was grainy, timestamped 1998. I clicked it. The screen flickered, then showed a backyard party. My 8th birthday. Balloons tangled in tree branches, a cake shaped like a butterfly, kids running through sprinklers. And there I was, little Bella, barefoot, messy-haired, laughing like the sky was inside me. My mom stood in the background filming. She called my name and I turned, squinting into the sun, grin wide and wild. "Say hi, birthday girl." I waved at the camera and shouted, "I'm 8 and I'm magic." The video ended. I sat frozen, hand over my mouth, sobbing in a way I didn't recognize. Not out of sadness, not even grief. It was grief for someone I used to be. For a version of me that once believed in cake and candles and the magic of being loved just because I existed. Somewhere between then and now, that little girl had been swallowed. Traded away for silence and shame and exile. But as I stared into her bright eyes, something stirred in me. A flicker. A memory. I wasn't always invisible. I had once been a girl who danced barefoot and believed the world clapped for her. Maybe that meant she was still in there somewhere. Still inside me. Somehow. The next morning, I showered. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I stood under the hot water and washed my hair. I scrubbed my skin like I was trying to remember its edges. I looked at myself in the mirror, not through but at, and said my name aloud. Isabella Marie West. It sounded foreign and familiar all at once. I dressed in jeans that hadn't fit in months. Clean shirt. Real shoes. I even put on mascara just for the ceremony of it. And then I did something terrifying. I reached out. I texted Lucy, my old college roommate. The one who stood in black at my funeral. The one I'd shared secrets and tequila and late-night takeout with for 4 years. I typed, Lucy, it's Isabella. I'm alive. I need you to believe me. The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. Then came a reply, who is this really? I sent a photo of us freshman year dorm hallway dressed like idiots for Halloween. Me as a bumblebee. Her as a slice of pizza. I followed with, it's not a joke. I didn't die, they lied. The bubble blinked again, then nothing, no response, no call. Just silence. I messaged 3 more people, old coworkers, a cousin, a neighbor, all read, none replied, and in that moment the grief returned. Not like a storm this time, more like a tide, gentle, relentless. I had wanted so badly for someone to believe me. But the world had made up its mind, and no one was coming to save me. That should have broken me. It almost did. But then I thought of the girl in the video. 8 years old. Magic. And I realized something crucial. I didn't need to be saved. I needed to remember. Remember who I was before the world convinced me I wasn't enough. Before they rewrote my story and handed my ending to someone else. Before they looked at me and saw an inconvenience instead of a daughter. I was never broken. I was never the problem. I was just inconvenient to a family who loved appearance more than truth. And if I could hold on to that, if I could carry that little girl inside me, her laugh, her belief in magic, then maybe I could carry myself back into the world. Even if I had to do it alone, I had stopped expecting replies. After Lucy. After the others. I assumed silence was the only language people still used with me. And maybe they weren't wrong. It's hard to believe in ghosts, especially when they text you out of nowhere and claim to be alive. But then, I remembered Ethan. Ethan was my cousin's youngest son. He was 15 when I disappeared. Sweet. Quiet. Always orbiting at the edges of family events with headphones around his neck and a sketchbook in his hand. When he was a kid, he used to call me Izzy Star. Said I was the only grown-up who didn't talk to him like he was stupid. I hadn't spoken to him in years. Still, something nudged me, instinct maybe. That same small voice that helped me trust my gut when spreadsheets didn't add up. I scrolled through my old contacts until I found his name, then hesitated. What if he didn't remember me? What if they'd filled his head with lies too? I stared at the blinking cursor in the message field for a long time. And then I typed, "Hey Ethan. It's Izzy. I know this might sound insane, but I'm alive. I need your help." I waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 20. Just as I was about to close the app, the 3 blinking dots appeared. He was typing. My heart lodged itself in my throat. Wait. What, are you serious? I almost cried. Yes. I never died. They lied. I need to know what they told you. There was a pause. Then they said, you were in a car crash. Overseas. It was too late to bring you back. Cremated. Memorial only. It was messed up. I asked why no one posted anything online. They said it was too painful. Cremated. Memorial only. I felt sick. You were the only one who didn't say goodbye, I replied. Maybe that's why I thought you'd believe me. His response was quiet but fast. I don't know why they'd lie. But I believe you, Izzy. I always did. That was the moment everything shifted. It didn't undo the erasure. It didn't make my name reappear in systems or banks or databases. But it reminded me I wasn't crazy. Someone else saw me. And once you know even one person believes you exist, it becomes harder to stay invisible. I stood up from my bed and walked straight to the cabinet. I pulled down every box folder and envelope I had brought back from Europe. Birth certificate, tax documents, passport, lease agreements, employment contracts, vaccination records, flight confirmations. Everything dated. Everything traceable. I spread them across the floor like evidence at a crime scene. Because that's what this was really. A crime. And I was ready to solve it. I began organizing. Stacking the government documents, first anything with a seal or barcode, then the financial records. Then personal identifiers, photos, signed letters, old journals. Proof that I hadn't just survived, I had lived. Worked, paid rent, filed taxes, voted, existed. There was a strange comfort in the paperwork. For once, numbers were on my side. Unbiased. Indifferent to emotion or family politics. Facts didn't lie. And facts, I realized, would be my resurrection. I emailed a copy of my passport stamps to a secure drive. I backed up my lease contracts. I photographed every document with timestamps. I even recorded a video of myself explaining the timeline of events just in case someone tried to claim I was mentally unstable or faking it. I wasn't preparing for war, I was preparing for court. Because the world didn't need to believe me to be forced to see me. But before I could do anything else, I had to confirm just how deep the lie ran. So I went digging. Public Records Office. County Registrar. I logged into the state's legal archives and searched my own name. There it was, Isabella Marie West. Date of death, the 16th of July 2020. Cause vehicular trauma disposition, cremated closed casket, certificate ID, CADHX, 327,415. My blood ran cold. There was an actual death certificate. Official. Registered. Filed 6 weeks after I left for Lisbon. The paperwork included a fake accident report dated the exact week I had arrived in Portugal. Someone had gone to incredible lengths to make this believable. Detailed injuries. A hospital name I'd never been to. Even an autopsy notation. I wasn't just declared dead, I was fabricated dead. This wasn't grief, this wasn't denial, this was a cover-up. And I was starting to understand why. I called Ethan again. Do you know if they ever received anything after my death? An inheritance, maybe. He hesitated. I'm not sure, but Fiona drives a Tesla now. And your dad kept talking about how she finally earned her place in the company. I didn't need more than that. It was enough. Someone had profited from my disappearance, and that meant I had leverage. Because now I had something more powerful than rage. I had receipts. It started with a scroll. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Maybe a distraction. Maybe a way to feel connected again. I hadn't opened Instagram in over a year, but I still remembered my login. Muscle memory brought me back in. The app opened like nothing had happened. The world had kept turning. Faces filtered in Valencia, smiles stretched wide, captions dripping with faux gratitude. Then her name appeared. Fiona. I didn't follow her anymore. But her profile was public again. And there it was. A glittering photo carousel of her wedding. I stared at the first image. Fiona stood beneath an arch of white roses, veil perfectly pinned, a dress that clung to her like privilege incarnate. Around her glass towers of champagne fairy lights, a crowd of adoring guests in black tie attire. The caption read, "The happiest day of my life. Thank you to the family who made me who I am." One seed, I swiped right. And there they were, my parents standing beside her, proud smiles etched onto their faces like they'd never mourned a thing. My father was holding Fiona's hand, his other arm around her shoulder. My mother looked radiant, eyes wet with joy, not grief. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a rebranding. I kept scrolling. Speech photos. Dancing photos. Toasts. And then one that stopped my breath. Fiona and her new husband stood beneath a canopy. Behind them, a projection screen displayed a slideshow of photos. One of them was of Fiona at age 12, another 16, and then came the one that broke me. It was my graduation photo. Only they had cropped me out. Just Fiona in the center smiling at the camera as if the other half of that day, the other daughter, had never existed. The caption below that post read, "To the one daughter who always made us proud." I felt my entire body go still. It wasn't just grief they'd staged when they declared me dead. It was a replacement. I had been cut from the frame, literally, figuratively, legally. Fiona didn't just survive my absence. She thrived in it. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath caught somewhere between a scream and a sob. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead to the cold glass. Outside, the world glittered: cars, laughter, the clink of glasses from a bar down the block. Joy everywhere. But none of it mine. I pulled out the folder of documents I'd started compiling. I flipped through birth certificates, passport, stamps, apartment leases. I needed to find something, anything that proved they had gained from my disappearance, and then I found it. A legal notice from the estate of Catherine West, my grandmother, dated 3 months after my declared death. It outlined a trust, one that had been originally named for me. College fund. Small business seed capital. Assets my grandmother left me directly in writing. Reassigned to Fiona. Transferred in the wake of Isabella West's passing. I read the words again and again, but they didn't change. Transferred. Reassigned. Gone. I wasn't just forgotten, I was replaced. I sat back on the floor, hands trembling, staring at Fiona's smiling face on the screen. The dress, the flowers, the inheritance. All of it my inheritance wrapped around a lie. I imagined my mother helping her into that gown, saying how proud she was. I imagined my father raising a toast. I imagined guests whispering, "She's really turned her life around." Because yes, Fiona had stolen money. But I was the one who disappeared. And that made her the good daughter now. That made me the storyline they could edit out. I closed the laptop, but my reflection in the dark screen stared back. There was something hollow in my eyes. Not pain, not even rage, just a vacancy. Like I'd been scooped out and replaced with silence. My mind wandered back to the kitchen table where I once sat, 14 years old, crying over a failed math quiz. My dad had placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You're still my brightest girl." I had believed him. I remembered the time Fiona lost our dog, and I searched for hours in the rain until we found him under the neighbor's porch. She cried. My mom hugged her. And I stood there drenched, forgotten. I remembered making pancakes on Mother's Day, setting them in the shape of hearts. My mother smiled and said Fiona made me a card. As if syrup and warmth meant nothing compared to glitter and glue. All those moments had quietly whispered something I hadn't been willing to hear back then. You were always optional. Now they had made it official. Watching Fiona wear my legacy like a tailored dress wasn't just betrayal, it was a confirmation of everything I feared, that I was only ever a placeholder, a backup, a burden they were grateful to let go of. She had stepped into the life I was supposed to have. Not stolen it with force, but received it with open arms like a gift. Wrapped in lies. Tied with a bow of plausible grief. And I had been the wrapping paper, torn, discarded, no longer needed. What haunted me most wasn't their joy, it was their ease. The way my father smiled into the microphone. The way my mother dabbed tears that didn't belong to me. They had rewritten history and made me the footnote. What kind of parent replaces their child like furniture? What kind of sister smiles while dancing on a grave? But perhaps the more haunting question was this. Why did it take me this long to believe they were capable of it, even after they threw me out? Even after the silence? Even after the funeral video? Some part of me still wanted to believe they were just scared, misled, human. But this wasn't human, this was design. I walked to the mirror, looked at my face. "This is not the end of my story," I whispered. And for the first time in years I believed it. Because Fiona could wear white and smile. But I would wear truth like armor. And I would walk back into the house that buried me, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as the reckoning they never saw coming. The morning air felt like a page waiting for ink, and I clutched the folder to my chest like a lifeline as I stepped into the law office. My hands were shaking, whether from cold or nerves, I wasn't sure, but every step inside that building felt heavier than the last. I no longer existed in the legal sense, at least not in the systems that governed identity, inheritance, and truth. But I remembered who I was, and more importantly, I had brought proof. The waiting area smelled like burnt paper and cheap coffee, humming with the muted urgency of a weekday. A young receptionist looked up from her screen and asked, "Name?" and for a second I hesitated, unsure whether to say it. But then I did. Isabella Marie West. She typed it in, paused, her eyes flickering slightly, and then said politely, "Please take a seat. Attorney Nolan will be with you shortly." When Nolan entered, he looked as if he expected a routine client. Young, sharp-suited, guarded. But the moment I handed him the folder and said I need to challenge a legal death declaration, something changed in his posture. I laid out the documents, one by one, passport stamps signed, lease agreements, digital tax filings, employment records, all dated after the supposed date of my death. When I finally added, they even filed a death certificate. Fabricated the accident, the hospital, everything, he asked quietly. "Who's they?" I met his eyes. "My parents." He didn't speak for a moment. Then carefully he began outlining our options: how we could file for a motion to revoke the declaration of death, how we might pursue a fraud complaint, how inheritance transfer under false pretenses could carry criminal consequences. "If what you're telling me holds up," he said, flipping through the pages slowly, "we're looking at one of the most deliberate erasures I've ever seen." We started drafting affidavits. He asked questions gently but thoroughly, piecing together my timeline, matching my visa entries to travel receipts, pulling threads that would soon unravel the lie they had built. I signed each page with a hand that grew steadier with every signature. Each form I completed felt like chiseling my name back into the stone of existence. By noon, I wasn't a ghost anymore. Not legally. Not emotionally. Just a woman reclaiming what had been stolen. Then my phone buzzed. A message. No words, just an image. A flyer. White background. Scripted font. A photograph of me framed in a digital border of lilies. "In loving memory of Isabella West, a celebration of life, Sunday, 3 p.m. Street. Albans Chapel." I showed it to Nolan. He stared at it, then back at me. "They're holding a memorial." "Another one," I whispered. "Second round. This one's invitation only." "Are you thinking about going?" I didn't answer for a moment. Then, "Yes. But not as a guest." That night, I sat alone on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by my documents, reviewing timelines like a detective at her final board. My name had been signed away. My body had been assigned to a lie. But I was still here. I ran my fingers over the seal on the death certificate, faintly embossed, cold to the touch. They had really tried to bury me. Not just in memory, but in law. In history. What they hadn't expected was that I'd come back with files, not fists. With facts, not rage. With a lawyer, not a gun. There's a kind of power in refusing to be reactive. In becoming surgical instead of explosive. For so long, I had imagined revenge as shouting confrontations, broken glass. But what I was building now was quieter, more devastating. It wasn't just about proving I was alive, it was about forcing them to admit they had chosen to forget. And so I signed the petition to revoke my death. Each stroke of my pen felt like I was carving my name back into the world, letter by letter, line by line. Nolan walked me through every section with measured calm, but even he couldn't fully mask his astonishment. "They planned this well," he murmured at one point, flipping through my travel dates. "This wasn't a mistake, they built this on purpose." I nodded. It was the first time someone outside of my story admitted the truth out loud, and hearing it made something old and rusted shift in my chest. Recognition, maybe. Or belief. The kind you thought had died. After Nolan submitted the documents for emergency review, I left his office lighter, not in weight, but in burden. A version of me had been buried 3 years ago. But the version walking out that door was no longer mourning. She was mobilizing. And though the walk back home should have been one of fear, this one was charged with clarity. I didn't spend the evening crying or pacing. I spent it preparing. I chose my clothes carefully, black, sharp, elegant but understated. Not a costume, not a disguise, just a version of myself that looked like someone you couldn't dismiss. I laid out the documents I would carry. The death certificate. The real-time stamped passport. My bank statements. I rehearsed the sequence in my head, how I would walk down the aisle, when I would speak, what I would say if I saw Fiona's face twist in recognition. I did not prepare for confrontation, I prepared for exposure. Because sometimes you don't come back to fight. You come back to illuminate. And this time I wouldn't need anyone to raise their voice. I would walk into my funeral and my presence alone would be enough to bring their performance to a halt. Not a ghost. Not a grieving daughter. But a woman alive, whole, and here to reclaim her place in the story. The church was already half full when the recording began playing, a slow creeping sound that slid down the aisle like fog, uninvited and unshakable. There was no introduction, no explanation, just two voices bleeding through the speakers, a conversation meant to stay buried, now resurrected in a room dressed for grief. The first voice was unmistakable, my mother's, clipped and cold. I don't care what we have to forge. Just make it look official. No one checks those things unless someone's alive, and she's not. Then a light laugh, brittle and cruel. Another voice followed Fiona's. She's alive. Just not where it matters. A collective gasp rippled across the pews like water disturbed by a dropped stone. The organist missed a note. People sat up straighter. Some looked at the speakers, others turned to each other with widened eyes. The recording continued. You think she'll ever come back? My mother asked. Fiona replied smoothly. Even if she does, there's nothing left for her to come back to. We own the narrative now. Someone dropped their program. The priest who had been preparing to open the service paused with a confused expression, his hand frozen mid-blessing. Then the massive oak doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, not softly, but with a drawn-out groan that made every head swivel. And I walked in. One foot in front of the other, my heels striking the floor like the ticking of a countdown. I wore black not for mourning but as a statement. Not a ghost in white but a witness dressed in quiet fury. Faces turned. Eyes widened. A little girl gasped and tugged her mother's sleeve. Is that? I didn't stop. I walked all the way down the aisle until I stood before my own photo, blown up, ringed with lilies, candles flickering on either side like I was a saint they wanted to believe in. My mother looked like she'd seen a resurrection. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. My father stood rigid, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Fiona stood behind them, gripping her clutch like it might anchor her to this reality. She said nothing. Her mouth had lost its smile. I turned slowly, letting my gaze sweep across the room. I could feel the silence press against my skin. Then I spoke. My name is Isabella Marie West, I said, and as you can see, I am not dead. My voice didn't need to be loud. The room was holding its breath. I took a breath and continued. What you heard a moment ago was not an act of fiction. It was a recording. It was real. My mother and my sister discussing how to make me disappear, not metaphorically but legally. They filed false documents. They forged a death certificate. They transferred my inheritance. And all of you, I let my eyes linger on the front rows, believed them. A murmur, then stillness again. I have the original paperwork here, passport stamps, lease agreements, tax forms. Proof that I was alive when they claimed I was gone. I stepped forward and placed the folder on the altar like it was scripture. What they did wasn't just cruel. It was calculated. It wasn't grief, it was greed. My mother finally found her voice. Isabella, please. We didn't know you did. I interrupted, not raising my voice but slicing the air with finality. You knew exactly where I was. You chose this. You crafted this. My father started to speak but stopped. For once, silence was his only defense. Fiona shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, but no words came. I turned to the guests. You wore black. You said goodbye, you cried. But none of you ever asked where I was. You mourned me because it was easier than confronting the truth that the people in this room were willing to erase someone to protect themselves. You could hear a pin drop. People shifted uncomfortably. A few stood. A man near the back whispered, "She has proof," and someone else hissed, "I thought she was in Europe." Another voice, "They lied." I let the silence do its work. Then I looked one final time at the photo above the altar, the version of me they preferred. Still. Silent. Gone. "You didn't lose a daughter," I said, my voice steady. "You threw one away. And now you get to watch her walk back in." No one stopped me as I turned on my heel and began to walk out. No one dared. The doors opened for me and I stepped into the sunlight like it was a second birth. No applause. No redemption arc. Just truth and the sound of everything they built cracking under the weight of it. I could feel my voice echo back at me, bouncing off the stained glass like proof of my own existence. People didn't just hear my words, they absorbed the impossibility of them, the betrayal. My mother had stopped crying and now stared at me with hollow eyes, mascara trembling at the edge of her lashes like it wanted to flee. My father remained seated, his jaw tight, hands gripping the edge of the pew like he was trying to keep his world from falling off its axis. Fiona, dressed in pale blue, now looked paler than ever, the color draining from her face as though truth itself had touched her skin. I didn't linger to watch them crumble. I didn't need to. I had already won the moment I walked in. I passed the final row and turned to face them all, relatives, strangers, the very people who had sent cards and messages after my passing, many of whom had never bothered to ask why they hadn't seen me for years. I didn't speak to accuse them, but they flinched like I had screamed. I let my silence draw out, stretching the moment until it frayed. Then I took a deep breath, steady and slow, and began. "My name is Isabella Marie West, and despite what you've been told, I am very much alive." They followed me outside like shadows, unsure of their place in the sunlight. The air was brisk but bright, the kind of late autumn afternoon where the wind carried a quiet judgment. I didn't plan to stay, but when I saw the small crowd gathering near the steps of the chapel, faces half familiar, all stunned, I knew I had one final task. I turned around. My mother stood frozen at the top of the steps, her gloved hand gripping the railing like she might fall if she let go. My father stood beside her, shoulders squared but his eyes darting like a man scanning for exits. Fiona, a few steps behind, had removed her shoes and held them in one hand like relics from a ceremony gone wrong. Her mascara had begun to streak. A young man stepped forward. It was Ethan. My cousin. His phone still recording. The live stream had started inside, capturing my walk down the aisle, my confrontation, my voice. But it was here outside that the town truly began to listen. I looked at my parents first. "You taught me how to tie my shoes, how to use my fork. You told me the world was dangerous, but that home would always be safe." I took a breath. "You lied." My mother opened her mouth, but I raised a hand gently. Not to silence her with force, but with mercy. "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "This is truth. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here so you can no longer pretend you didn't hurt me." My father's jaw twitched. "We did what we thought was best for the family." "No," I said. "You did what was easiest for the ones you loved more." The weight of it didn't need drama. It landed with the heaviness of facts. I turned to Fiona. She looked smaller now, like someone who had outgrown her borrowed power. "Do you remember when you broke Mom's necklace and blamed me?" I asked. Her eyes blinked fast and her lips parted, but no words came. "That was the first time I realized you were willing to sacrifice me to stay golden." I stepped closer. "You were always afraid I would shine brighter. That's why you made sure I never had the chance." She finally spoke, but her voice cracked. "You don't understand what it's like being the one who's always expected to be perfect." I smiled, not with cruelty, but with clarity. "No, Fiona. You were expected to be protected. I was expected to be blamed." I paused. "And when I left, you stepped into my life like it had always been yours." She lowered her eyes. The silence that followed wasn't for shame, it was for reflection. Then I turned to the people standing nearby. A few of them had once been friends. Girls I'd grown up with. Neighbors, classmates. Some had liked my posts once. Some had sent emojis when the obituary circulated. Not a single one had called. To those who didn't know, I said, "You're forgiven." To those who knew and stayed silent, ask yourselves what it means to attend a funeral for someone you didn't even bother to check on. A few looked away. One woman whispered, "I thought she moved abroad." Another man murmured, "But it was her family. How could we question them?" You don't need to question everything I said, just the things that don't feel right. Silence is how erasure survives. I reached into my coat and pulled out a printed version of the death certificate. I held it up. This was filed while I was working 12-hour shifts at a cafe in Lisbon. This said I was cremated after a fatal crash that never happened. This erased me from systems, from memory, from law, but not from truth. I looked at the camera at Ethan, still holding the phone steady. Let this recording stand not as a scandal but as a correction. Then I smiled, small, peaceful, resolute. I am not here to demand tears. I am here to reclaim my breath. Behind me someone started clapping. Then another. It wasn't loud, it wasn't coordinated, it was awkward. But it was real. The kind of applause not for performance but for courage. I didn't bow, I didn't wave. I just stood still as the ripple of sound passed through the onlookers like a quiet apology from the universe. My mother turned away. My father said nothing. Fiona sat down on the stone ledge near the church garden, shoes at her feet, face in her hands. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk. Each footstep was light, not because the road was easy but because it was mine again. And as I crossed the street, I heard someone whisper behind me. She didn't raise her voice once. Someone else replied, "She didn't have to." No, I didn't. Because the truth, when spoken plainly, doesn't need to scream to be heard. The courtroom smelled like old wood and final chances. It took months, paperwork stacked like bricks, hearings, and quiet testimonies. But the day came when the judge read her decision in a voice that made no room for confusion. The declaration of death is hereby revoked. The estate in question will remain frozen pending investigation. The petitioner is legally recognized as Isabella Marie West, a living citizen with full rights restored. The gavel fell. No applause. No dramatics. Just a sound that broke a curse. I walked out of that courtroom, not triumphant but whole. Outside reporters waited like vultures, their questions sharpened and rehearsed. I didn't stop. I wasn't a story for them to simplify. I was no one's redemption arc. I was just someone who survived. I took a train without a destination, then a bus, then a walk. I ended up at the edge of the coast, an old shoreline I once visited as a child. No cameras, no curious stares, just the wind, the salt, the sky. I hadn't brought much with me. Just a photo album and a matchbook from the cafe in Lisbon where I used to mop floors and pretend I didn't miss my name. I sat near the shore and opened the album. Pages turned like breath, Christmas smiles, birthday candles, frozen laughter. I didn't cry. I just watched the images as if they belonged to someone else. Then I struck a match. The fire didn't roar. It whispered. It curled the pages into memory-shaped ash. I watched the photos burn, not because I hated them but because I no longer needed proof that I once belonged. I whispered to the flames, "I don't need them. I need me." The sea breeze carried the ashes across the sand like absolution. I closed my eyes and listened, not for voices of the past but for the beat of my own breath. It was steady. Real. Mine. I remembered the Lisbon mornings, quiet streets, tiny espresso cups, the way I learned to say bom dia with a soft smile. I remembered rooftop evenings, hanging laundry and whispering old dreams into the wind. I had vanished, yes, but in that vanishing I had also built something truer. I was not forged by tragedy, I was revealed by it. I had loved myself back into existence. No one gave me permission to return. I claimed it. That night, I wrote a letter, not to them, not to the courts or the papers, but to myself. Dear Isabella, you made it. You believed yourself when no one else did. You held on even when invisible. You don't owe anyone revenge. You owe yourself peace. Keep going. I folded it into a bottle, sealed it, and tossed it gently into the ocean, not to be found but to be released. The tide took it without question. The stars blinked above like witnesses who asked for nothing. I sat on the sand barefoot, no audience, and for the first time in years I didn't feel invisible, I felt invincible. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped needing to. The sea did not care who had wronged me. It did not need to know my story. It offered movement, not memory. I let go. Of the need to be understood, of the hunger to be believed, of the hope that someone would say sorry. I didn't need closure. I needed space. And now I had it. I lay back on the sand and looked up at the stars, not to search for answers but to remember how vast the sky is. I wasn't alone. I was with myself. And that was enough. In the distance, a wave broke. A gull cried. The wind moved gently across my skin like something sacred. The life I had built in silence would never make headlines. But it was real. It was mine. And it would keep going. I didn't forgive them. I didn't forget. But I no longer needed either to feel free. The greatest freedom wasn't walking back into the courtroom. It was walking away from needing to be seen. Sometimes you don't heal by being heard. You heal by hearing yourself. Sometimes the final chapter is not justice, it's joy. Quiet chosen, hard-earned joy. And sometimes the ending isn't an ending at all. It's just you standing at the edge of the sea smiling softly into the wind and beginning again.